Hello, my name is Geraldine Timler, and I'm an associate professor at James Madison University. I'm going to be your host for this three-part series on language sampling, a professional development opportunity sponsored by the Virginia Department of Education. I do have some disclosures. I receive a salary from James Madison University, and I did receive financial compensation for the development of these modules from the VDOE. I have nothing non-financial to disclose. Let's look at your learner outcomes for the three language sampling modules. In the first module, you'll be able to list optimal language sampling contexts for various age groups and describe best practices for collection of conversation samples. In Module 2, you'll be able to identify areas of concern in conversational language samples and how to select analyses for syntactic, morphological, semantic, and pragmatic behaviors. Finally, in Module 3, you'll learn how to implement a protocol for eliciting samples that highlight pragmatic language behaviors and how to use a rating scale to document these behaviors. Let's focus on our agenda for Module 1. In this agenda, we'll talk about the rationale for collection of language samples, the recommended sampling contexts for students of various ages, the general procedures for collection of language samples, and specific considerations for collections of conversation samples. And then finally at the end, I'll provide some practice opportunities to help you identify clinician behaviors and also to develop clinician behaviors when collecting conversation samples. Let's start with the rationale. Why collect language samples? Well, as you know, ASHA and the Virginia Department of Education describe language sampling as an important component of comprehensive assessment. That includes contributing to the identification of an impairment for establishment of eligibility, providing data for IEP teams, establishing a baseline of communication behaviors, informing intervention goals, and finally to provide data for progress monitoring. Here are a few more important reasons for collecting language samples. Language samples may be less biased than norm reference tests, particularly for culturally and linguistically diverse populations. A good language sample, one that's representative, provides an authentic view of students' real-life functional communication skills. A language sample might reveal communication concerns that were not identified by a norm reference test. And moreover, it can confirm parent and teacher concerns in one or more communication skill areas, including syntax, morphology, semantics, pragmatics, phonology, speech intelligibility, and fluency. And finally, language sampling can be used to confirm specific errors on test items from a norm reference test. So most of our norm reference tests, for example, only have a few past tense items. The language sample can be used to confirm that the child does have trouble with past tense, or maybe to find out that it was only those particular items that the child had trouble with, and in a language sample he actually does fine with past tense use. This graphic by Pizzold, Imgrund, and Storkel displays recommended language sampling contexts by age. As you can see here, in the early childhood and preschool years, you can collect samples during play with toys. You just want to make sure that when you compare your child's sample with samples from a normative database, that those samples were also collected during play with toys and not just a conversation with an examiner. Once a student enters preschool, you want to collect more than one sample. So you want to have samples that include conversation samples with an adult and then a narrative sample that can either be a story retell or story generation. Usually in the preschool years, story retell is recommended. As students advance through early elementary and elementary school, you want to add an additional discourse, and that's expository discourse. And then finally, during the adolescent years, you want to also add a persuasive discourse sample. Just a quick review about these samples. So we know that if we want to elicit complex syntax, The best way to do that is through narrative discourse, expository discourse, and persuasive discourse. So you could do a narrative retell where you read a story to the student, usually one that also includes pictures, may or may not have words. You may be telling the story, and then you ask the student to retell the story immediately after. You could also do a narrative generation task where you give the student a single picture, a series of pictures, or a wordless picture book and ask them to make their own or generate a narrative. You could do an expository sample. An expository is usually a sample where you're asking a student to describe rules or a situation, such as how to play a game or sport, how to complete a recipe, or how to complete procedures for an experiment. And then the last one is persuasive, which we normally do with adolescents. Here you're going to ask a student to pick out a rule or situation they want to change in school, a job, or in a community setting. And typically for these samples, you'll want to look at Nicole's work because she usually provides a planning sheet. So there is some pre-planning before you're asking the student to provide this sample. Let's look at procedures for collection of language samples. We'll start with general procedures, whether you're collecting conversation, narratives, expository, or persuasive samples, and then the rest of this module will focus on clinician behaviors for elicitation of conversation samples. Let's review general procedures for collecting language samples, no matter what the context is. Obviously, as we've just reviewed, you want to collect multiple samples and appropriate sample context for a student's age. You want to video or audio record the sample for later analysis, and you want to use engaged listening. So you want to think about your eye contact as you're talking with the student and using an engaged or enthusiastic facial expression. For young children, you want to talk at their language level. If the child is talking in short sentences, you want to talk and answer back in short sentences. You want to repeat, and sometimes this is called glossing or gloss, the student's linguistic and speech sound errors. You do this so that when you're listening to the sample later, you won't miss these errors in your analysis. You also, after you take a turn with a student, and that turn might be simply glossing what they just said, you want to pause. Sometimes this is called expectantly waiting or expectant waiting, and you want to pause after your comment or question or gloss to give the student an opportunity to respond. We know that students with language impairment are less responsive than other students, so we need to give them that time to see if they're going to respond and what that response looks like. And then you want to use process questions such as how and why, because these elicit complex syntax. And as much as possible, you want to avoid the use of yes/no questions, which only elicit a simple single-word response. Now let's focus on the collection of language samples and the clinician procedures that you should use to elicit these samples. In addition to everything we've just talked about, you want to use contingent comments, or as Pavelko and Owens call them, turnabouts. And a contingent comment or turnabout, the definition for that is a comment that continues or builds upon the child's comment or question rather than changing the topic or the subject. So here are some examples of contingent comments. Tell me more. I'd like to hear about that. That sounds like fun. That's my favorite too. Remember to follow your contingent comment with a pause and expected waiting, as we've already talked about. Let's practice identifying contingent comments and thinking of your own contingent comments. In this first sample, which is an audio clip only, the clinician begins the sample with, "Tell me a little bit about your family." Listen to the child's response. Think of a contingent comment to respond to the child's comment, "My mom, whenever I need help, she helps me."
Tell me a little bit about your family.
My mom, whenever I need help, she helps me.
In the list below, identify the contingent comment or comments and think about whether your comment is similar to one of these. A, "Oh, your mom helps you." B, do you like it when your mom helps you? C, tell me more about your mom helping you. Or D, I bet your dad is nice too. Can you pick out the contingent comments? Well, the first one is A, oh, your mom helps you. That definitely builds upon what the student was already talking about. So that gets our red star. B, do you like it when your mom helps you? It does continue the topic, but that's a yes-no question, and it's likely just to elicit a yes or a no. It would be better to reword this question as something like, I wonder why you like it when your mom helps you. Let's look at C. Tell me more about your mom helping you. That one also earns a red star because that one continues a topic the child seems to be excited about. D. I bet your dad is nice too. Well, this topic of dad is still about the family. It really takes the student away from a topic that he seems interested in talking about. So it doesn't earn a red star. In this video clip, the clinician finds out that this student plays the violin, and she asks, do you practice a lot? See if you can replace this question with a contingent comment. And just a warning, you may want to turn up the volume on this video clip because her first few sentences are very quiet.
I don't know how to farm, and I have a little land and a lot more songs.
How did you learn how to play the violin?
My music teacher taught me.
Oh yeah? Do you practice a lot? How often do you practice with her?
Let's see if the comment you came up with matched any of the choices below. These would all work. Tell me more about your music teacher. I bet you practice a lot. Or I wonder how much you practice. These would all be considered contingent comments or turnabouts. Let's look at one final video clip. In this next clip, this is a conversation sample, but within this conversation sample, this child is sharing a past tense event, and sometimes those are referred to as personal recounts. And you're going to hear the child say, and he's one of the mean guys in my neighborhood. Can you think of a contingent comment to encourage her to keep talking? Here's the video clip.
And one of the boys in my class, his mom was there, and he was going for his big sister, Mariella. She's in 3rd grade, and he's one of the mean guys in my neighborhood.
Oh.
On his car window on my first.
So she says, and he's one of the mean guys in my neighborhood. In the list below, can you identify a contingent comment or comments? So A, I wonder what he does that is so mean. B, what neighborhood do you live in? C, did you tell your mom? Or D, tell me more about him. So A, I wonder what he did that is, or what he does that is so mean is definitely a contingent comment that continues with her topic. What neighborhood do you live in is slightly off topic, and it's likely also to just elicit a single word response. Did you tell your mom? We might want to know whether she did, but that's also just a yes-no question. So we want to try to avoid those yes-no questions in language samples. And finally, D gets another red star because tell me more about him is likely to elicit further description of what he does that's so mean. For this last audio clip, I'm going to ask you to do something a little bit different. I really want you to pay attention to all of the behaviors that you hear the clinician do to elicit this sample. Then in the next slide, I'm going to ask you to identify these behaviors. So this is a little bit longer clip than we've been listening to.
And I have Emily broke her arm.
You want to tell me about how Emily broke her arm?
Yeah, because she had something to climb on, a monkey ball thing, and then she jumped off, so when she landed, she hit it in the middle, and she broke her arm.
She hit it in the middle and she broke her arm?
No, middle
Oh, on the
metal.
metal?
Yeah.
Oh boy, that must have
She was
hurt.
crying to death.
She was crying to death?
Yeah.
I bet that hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, was she outside?
Yeah. I was outside.
Where? At your house?
Yeah. Now we had to take it down. Trampoline.
Oh, that
The
sounds
trampoline is super fun
that sounds like even more fun.
because it's like this big and it can just jump. I can grab a net, the end of the net,
The end of the net?
the top of the net.
Yeah? Tell me about what you do when you're on the trampoline.
Sometimes then I go on my butt.
Oh,
It's very fun.
I bet that sounds fun when you jump and you go on your butt. That sounds like a lot of fun.
And sometimes Emily she gets a cramp in her leg, so she
She gets a cramp in her leg, so
Yeah.
she gives up.
yeah,
Oh boy.
just for a little while. And when I get a cramp, I still jump.
When you get a cramp, you still jump?
Yeah, like in my legs.
Mm.
Squidward.
All right, in the list below, identify the recommended language sampling elicitation behaviors that you heard in this audio clip. A, yes/no question. B, glossing or repeating of a student linguistic and speech sound errors. C, a process question or statement. Or D, a contingent comment or turnabout. Well, we actually heard all 4 of these behaviors from this clinician, but only B, C, and D are recommended behaviors. In this case, asking 1 or 2 yes/no questions probably would not have stopped this boy from talking. But generally, we want to avoid those questions because we can see from listening to this that process questions and contingent comments are more likely to elicit longer turns from the child. And of course, this child did have some linguistic and speech sound errors, so the clinician did gloss or repeat those errors so that she remembers them when she goes back to analyze this sample. Let's talk about some clinician behaviors to avoid. First of all, you don't want to write copious notes. I would say not any notes while you're collecting the sample. That's because you do want to use engaged listening. You don't want to talk too rapidly. You want to talk at the student's linguistic level and at the same rate as the student, and you do want to use pause time after you comment or question. You want to limit your use of yes/no questions and instead replace those yes/no questions with either process questions like how or why, or statements such as I wonder instead of a question. And then you don't want to switch topics too frequently. Let the child switch topics. You instead will do contingent commenting or questioning to build on the student's utterances. All right, so this ends Module 1. You can take the knowledge check for Module 1 that you will find back on the VDOE website, and then listen to Module 2, which is a review of different types of analyses for conversation language samples.